October 14, 1944. A muddy foxhole near the Siegfried Line, Germany. Private Theodore Walsh crouched in the darkness, his hands wrapped around a rifle that everyone said he was too weak to carry, and watched 200 German soldiers advance toward the American positions through the pre-dawn fog. Theodore weighed 127 pounds. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. He had failed his first physical examination because the army doctors said his arms were too thin to handle the recoil of a standard infantry rifle. Now, those thin arms were the only thing standing between a German assault force and 37 wounded Americans who could not be evacuated. The rest of his platoon was dead or scattered. The radio was destroyed. The officers were gone. There was no one to give orders, no one to call for reinforcements, no one to tell Theodore what to do. So he did what no one expected. He climbed out of his foxhole, moved to the machine gun that his fallen sergeant had been operating, and opened fire. In the next 6 hours, Theodore Walsh would hold that position alone against repeated German attacks. He would burn through the ammunition of 3 machine guns. He would use his rifle when the machine guns overheated. He would use grenades when his rifle jammed. He would use a shovel when the grenades ran out. And when the sun rose over the battlefield and American reinforcements finally arrived, they found Theodore Walsh standing in a field of 89 German dead, his body riddled with wounds, his uniform soaked with blood that was mostly not his own. The man they said was too weak to carry a rifle had just become the deadliest single soldier of the entire Siegfried Line campaign. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the extraordinary courage hidden inside ordinary people, the moments when those who were underestimated proved that strength has nothing to do with size. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and help us remember these stories together. Now let us go back to the beginning to understand how a small, quiet boy from Massachusetts became a legend. Theodore Walsh was born in the winter of 1924, in a cramped apartment above a shoe factory in Fall River, Massachusetts. His father, Patrick, worked in the textile mills that had once made the city prosperous. His mother, Mary, took in laundry from the wealthier families across the river and stretched every penny until it screamed. Theodore was the youngest of 6 children, and from the moment of his birth he was different from his siblings. He was small, not just short, but genuinely small, as if his body had been built to a different scale than everyone around him. By the time he was 10, his older brothers towered over him. By the time he was 14, children years younger than him looked down when they spoke to him. The doctors said there was nothing wrong with him. He was simply small, they explained, the way some people are tall or some people have red hair. His bones were properly formed, his organs functioned correctly, his mind was sharp and clear. He was just compressed somehow, packed into a frame that nature had decided would never grow beyond a certain limit. Fall River was not a kind place for small boys. The children at school mocked him relentlessly. They called him runt, shrimp, half-pint, mouse. They pushed him in the hallways and stole his lunch and told him that he would never amount to anything because the world belonged to big men. And Theodore Walsh would never be a big man. Theodore endured. He endured because his mother had taught him that size was not the measure of a person. She told him stories of small men who had done great things: David against Goliath, Napoleon Bonaparte, the jockeys who won the Kentucky Derby on horses that weighed 10 times what they did. She told him that what mattered was not the size of the body, but the size of the heart that beat inside it. Theodore believed her mostly, but there were nights when he lay awake in the apartment above the shoe factory, listening to the machinery grind through the darkness, and wondered if his mother was simply being kind. He graduated from high school in 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His older brothers had already enlisted, swept up in the wave of patriotic fervor that followed the Japanese attack. Patrick Jr. was in the Pacific. Michael was in North Africa. Sean was training to be a bomber pilot in Texas. Theodore wanted to join them. His father told him to wait. Patrick Walsh had seen the First War, had watched his own brothers march off to France and come back as broken men who drank too much and screamed in their sleep. He knew what combat did to people, and he did not want his smallest son to experience it. But Theodore would not wait. He went to the recruitment office in Providence, stood in line with men who looked like giants beside him, and submitted himself for examination. The doctor who examined him was a tired man in his 50s, who had been processing recruits for 18 hours straight. He measured Theodore's height, his weight, his chest expansion. He tested his vision and his hearing and his reflexes. Then he shook his head. He told Theodore that he was too small. He told him that the army had minimum standards for a reason, that soldiers needed to carry heavy equipment over long distances, that a man of Theodore's size would be a liability in combat. He told him to go home and find another way to serve his country. Theodore went home. But he did not give up. He spent the next 6 months building himself up. He lifted weights fashioned from scrap metal at the factory. He ran 5 miles every morning before his shift. He ate everything he could get his hands on, trying to pack muscle onto his narrow frame. He gained 11 pounds. He grew not a single inch. When he returned to the recruitment office in the spring of 1943, a different doctor examined him. This one was younger, more sympathetic, and perhaps more willing to bend the rules for a persistent young man who so clearly wanted to serve. The doctor looked at Theodore's file, looked at Theodore himself, and made a decision. He wrote acceptable on the form and told Theodore to report for basic training in 2 weeks. Theodore Walsh was going to war. Basic training was at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and from the first day, Theodore understood that his size would continue to haunt him. The drill sergeants took one look at him and assigned him to a squad of men who seemed to have been selected specifically to emphasize his smallness. His squad mates were farm boys from the Midwest, factory workers from Pennsylvania, longshoremen from New York, all of them broad-shouldered and heavy-handed and utterly contemptuous of the little man from Fall River. They called him Mouse. They called him Tiny. They called him the mascot. Theodore said nothing. The training was brutal, designed to transform civilians into soldiers in a matter of weeks. They marched for miles with heavy packs. They crawled through mud under barbed wire while live ammunition crackled overhead. They ran obstacle courses that seemed designed to break the human body. Theodore struggled. The pack that other men carried with ease felt like an anchor on his narrow shoulders. The rifle that his squad mates handled casually seemed to weigh 100 pounds in his thin arms. The obstacles that larger men vaulted over required Theodore to find alternative routes, to use technique and determination where others used raw strength. His squad leader, a corporal named Hendricks from Ohio, made no secret of his contempt. He assigned Theodore the heaviest equipment, the longest watches, the worst duties. He mocked him in front of the other men and predicted loudly and often that Theodore would wash out before training was complete. Theodore did not wash out. He adapted. He learned to distribute weight more efficiently across his frame. He developed techniques for handling his rifle that compensated for his limited upper body strength. He discovered that his small size gave him advantages in certain situations. He could move through tight spaces that larger men could not, could hide in positions that would have left others exposed, could endure in conditions where bigger bodies required more food and water, and he learned something else, something that would define him for the rest of the war. He learned that he was not afraid. The other men in his squad showed fear in various ways: nervous laughter before difficult exercises, trembling hands during live fire drills, the 1,000 small tells that revealed the terror lurking beneath the surface. Theodore felt none of it. He did not know why. Perhaps it was because he had spent his entire life being underestimated, being told that he could not do things that he then did anyway. Perhaps it was because his mother's stories had given him a framework for understanding himself that transcended physical limitations. Perhaps it was simply that fear required imagination, and Theodore's imagination was entirely occupied with the practical problems of survival. Whatever the reason, the drill sergeants noticed. One of them, a master sergeant named O'Brien, who had fought in the Pacific, pulled Theodore aside during the final week of training. O'Brien was a hard man, scarred and weathered by combat, and he did not waste words. He told Theodore that he had been watching him. He told him that size was the least important quality in a soldier, and that Theodore had something that most of the bigger men in his squad would never possess. He did not say what that something was. He did not need to. Theodore graduated from basic training in the middle of his class, not a distinguished position, but respectable given his physical limitations. He was assigned to an infantry division preparing for deployment to Europe, and in the spring of 1944 he shipped out across the Atlantic. He left behind a family that feared for him and arrived in a world that would test him beyond anything he could have imagined. Theodore landed in France in August of 1944, 2 months after D-Day. The beaches had been secured and the Allied forces were pushing inland, but the fighting was still fierce and the casualties were mounting. His division was assigned to the American First Army, part of the massive force that was grinding its way toward the German border. The plan was to breach the Siegfried Line, the formidable system of fortifications that defended the Reich itself, and pour into the heart of Germany. The plan looked simple on maps in headquarters tents. On the ground, it was a nightmare of blood and mud and death. Theodore's first combat came near the town of Aachen, where German defenders fought with the desperate fury of men protecting their homeland. The battle lasted 3 weeks and cost thousands of lives on both sides. Theodore killed his first enemy soldier on the 3rd day of the fighting. It was a German private, young and terrified, who had stumbled into the ruined building where Theodore's squad was sheltering. The German raised his rifle. Theodore fired first. The German fell, and Theodore stood looking at the body for a long moment, waiting to feel something. Guilt, perhaps, horror, the weight of having ended a human life. He felt nothing but relief that it was the other man lying on the floor instead of himself. That absence of emotion troubled Theodore in the quiet moments between battles. He wondered if something was wrong with him, if his small body contained some corresponding smallness of soul that prevented him from feeling what normal people felt. But there was no time for philosophical reflection in the grinding advance toward Germany. There was only the next position to take, the next objective to secure, the next night to survive. Theodore proved himself in those weeks. He was not the strongest soldier in his squad, but he was among the most reliable. He did not panic under fire. He did not freeze when decisions needed to be made. He carried his weight and occasionally the weight of others, and gradually the contempt of his squadmates transformed into something that resembled respect. Corporal Hendricks, the squad leader who had tormented him during training, was killed by a sniper near the German border. His replacement was a sergeant named Patterson, a quiet professional from Virginia, who cared more about results than appearances. Patterson assigned Theodore to scout duty, recognizing that his small size made him ideal for moving undetected through contested terrain. Theodore accepted the assignment without complaint and discovered that he had a talent for it. He could move through the ruined landscape of war like a ghost, slipping through gaps that larger men could not navigate, hiding in positions that would have left others exposed. He developed an instinct for danger, a sixth sense that told him when German eyes were watching and when it was safe to move. His reports saved lives. His warnings prevented ambushes. His intelligence helped his company advance when other units were stalled. And still, some men called him Mouse. Still, some men looked at his narrow shoulders and thin arms and wondered how he had made it this far. Theodore said nothing. He had learned that words were useless against prejudice. Only actions mattered. The Siegfried Line was a monster. Concrete bunkers, tank traps, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire stretched across the German border for hundreds of miles. The fortifications had been built over years, designed by engineers who understood exactly how to make an attacking army bleed. Theodore's company was assigned to a sector near the town of Stolberg, where the American advance had stalled against particularly fierce resistance. The plan was to probe the German defenses, identify weak points, and prepare for a larger assault that would breach the line and open the road to the Rhine. The night of October 13th was cold and wet, with a fog that rolled in from the German hills and reduced visibility to almost nothing. Theodore's platoon was dug into a series of foxholes on a low ridge overlooking the German positions, tasked with holding the ground they had taken during the day's fighting. There were 42 men in the platoon when darkness fell. By midnight, that number had been reduced by enemy mortar fire and a probing attack that had been beaten back at the cost of 5 dead and 3 wounded. Theodore was in a foxhole on the left flank, partnered with a private from Chicago named Kowalski, who complained constantly about the cold and the mud and the general unfairness of life. Theodore listened without responding, his eyes fixed on the fog-shrouded landscape ahead. Something was wrong. He could not have explained how he knew. There was no sound, no movement, nothing visible in the darkness that should have triggered alarm. But Theodore's instincts, honed by months of combat, were screaming at him. He told Kowalski to be ready. The Chicago private grumbled, but checked his rifle. The German attack came at 03:47 hours. They emerged from the fog like ghosts, 200 men moving in disciplined formation, their advance covered by mortar fire that began falling on the American positions with devastating accuracy. The first shells hit the center of the platoon line, where the lieutenant and the senior NCOs had established their command post. The explosions were bright and violent, and when the smoke cleared, the command structure of the platoon no longer existed. Theodore saw his Sergeant Patterson thrown into the air by a direct hit. He saw the radio operator torn apart by shrapnel. He saw men he had fought beside for months reduced to broken shapes in the mud. The Germans kept coming. Kowalski panicked. He fired wildly into the fog, screaming obscenities, and a German bullet found him 3 seconds later. He slumped against the side of the foxhole with a surprised expression, and Theodore knew without checking that he was dead. All along the line, the American positions were being overrun. Men were fighting and dying in the fog, their screams mixing with the chatter of automatic weapons and the crump of explosions. Theodore had a choice. He could stay in his foxhole, keep his head down, hope that the attack passed over him. He could try to retreat, falling back toward the rear positions where reinforcements might be organizing. He could surrender, raise his hands and hope that the Germans took prisoners, or he could fight. Theodore climbed out of his foxhole. 30 yards away, at the center of the now silent command post, sat a .30 caliber machine gun. Its operator was dead, slumped over the weapon, but the gun itself appeared intact. Theodore ran. The fog swirled around him, gunfire crackled from every direction. And somehow he crossed those 30 yards without being hit. He pulled the dead operator aside, checked the weapon and found it loaded and ready. He looked up and saw the German assault force emerging from the fog ahead of him. Dozens of them, scores of them, more than he could possibly count. Theodore opened fire. The first burst cut down the leading elements of the German advance like a scythe through wheat. Theodore had never fired a machine gun in combat before. During training, he had been assigned to other duties, his small size deemed unsuitable for the heavy weapon, but his hands knew what to do, guided by weeks of observation and the desperate clarity that comes when death is the only alternative. The Germans faltered. They had expected to roll over a shattered American position, to finish off the survivors and secure the ridge before dawn. They had not expected to meet concentrated automatic fire from a single determined defender. Theodore kept firing. The fog was both enemy and ally. It hid the Germans' numbers, preventing Theodore from seeing how hopelessly outnumbered he was. But it also hid him, making it impossible for the enemy to pinpoint his exact position and concentrate their return fire. The first machine gun overheated after 15 minutes of continuous firing. Theodore felt the barrel glowing through the metal sleeve, felt the weapon beginning to malfunction. He abandoned it and crawled to another position, where a dead corporal lay beside a second machine gun. He resumed firing. The Germans regrouped and attacked again. This time they came with more caution, using the fog as cover, trying to flank the position that was costing them so many men. Theodore saw shapes moving on his left, adjusted his fire and cut them down before they could complete their maneuver. He was wounded for the first time an hour into the battle. A rifle bullet passed through his left shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. Theodore barely noticed. He switched hands, firing right-handed now, and continued to pour fire into the advancing enemy. The second wound came at 05:15 hours. Shrapnel from a grenade tore into his leg, and for a moment Theodore thought he was finished. But the leg still worked, still supported his weight when he needed to move, and the pain was distant, muffled by something that Theodore did not recognize as shock. He kept fighting. The second machine gun ran out of ammunition shortly after dawn, began to lighten the eastern horizon. Theodore grabbed his rifle and continued firing, picking his targets now, conserving the ammunition he had left. The Germans sent a squad to flank him on the right. Theodore anticipated the movement, shifted position, and caught them in a crossfire that left 7 men dead in the space of 30 seconds. A German officer stood up in the fog, trying to rally his men for another assault. Theodore shot him through the chest. Another officer replaced him. Theodore shot that one too. By 06:30 hours, Theodore had exhausted his rifle ammunition. He found a bag of grenades near one of the fallen American soldiers and used them to repel 2 more attacks, throwing with an accuracy that his thin arms should not have been able to produce. When the grenades were gone, Theodore found a shovel. The final German attack came at 0712 hours. A squad of 8 men who had managed to work their way around the American position through a gully that Theodore had not been able to cover. They emerged from the fog barely 10 yards away, rifles raised, confident that they had finally found the single defender who had been destroying their company. Theodore met them with the shovel. It was not supposed to be possible. 8 men with rifles against 1 small man with a digging tool. The mathematics of combat said that Theodore should have died in the first second of that encounter, but Theodore had stopped calculating mathematics hours ago. He moved with a speed and ferocity that the Germans were not prepared for. The shovel was a weapon in his hands, not a tool, and he used it with the same cold precision he had applied to the machine gun and the rifle and the grenades. 3 Germans fell before the others understood what was happening. 2 more fell as they tried to bring their rifles to bear. The remaining 3 broke and ran, scrambling back into the fog, and Theodore let them go. He stood in the pre-dawn light, surrounded by the bodies of the men he had killed, his uniform soaked with blood from wounds he could no longer count, and waited for the next attack. It never came. The American reinforcements arrived at 0834 hours. They had been fighting their way forward since dawn, responding to fragmentary reports of an attack on the forward positions. They expected to find a disaster, a platoon overrun, survivors scattered and demoralized. What they found was Theodore Walsh. He was standing at the center of the former command post, the shovel still in his hands, swaying slightly on his wounded leg. Around him, in a rough semicircle that extended nearly 100 yards in every direction, lay the bodies of German soldiers. The reinforcing company's commander, a captain named Morrison, walked through the carnage with an expression of disbelief. He counted the bodies. He traced the lines of fire. He reconstructed the battle from the evidence scattered across the ridge. 89 German dead, 1 American defender, 6 hours of continuous combat. Morrison found Theodore still standing, still holding the shovel, his eyes fixed on the fog that was beginning to lift as the sun rose higher. The captain asked Theodore if he was all right. Theodore looked at him as if the question made no sense. Then he collapsed. The medics who treated Theodore found 7 separate wounds, bullet and shrapnel injuries that should have killed him hours ago. They could not understand how he had remained standing, how he had continued to fight, how his small body had endured damage that would have incapacitated men twice his size. Theodore spent 3 weeks in a field hospital, then another 2 months in a recovery facility in England. The doctors told him that his war was over, that the damage to his leg would prevent him from returning to combat. Theodore did not argue. He had done enough. The news of what happened on the ridge near Stolberg spread through the American forces like fire through dry grass. The story grew with each retelling, acquiring details and embellishments that made it sound more like legend than history. But the core of the story was true, and everyone who heard it understood what it meant. The smallest man in the platoon, the soldier they had called Mouse, had held the line alone against 200 Germans and won. Theodore received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House in the spring of 1945. President Truman pinned the medal on his chest and said words that Theodore barely heard, something about courage and sacrifice and the American spirit. The newspapers published his photograph, and suddenly the quiet boy from Fall River was famous. Reporters wanted interviews. Hollywood wanted to make a movie. Companies wanted him to endorse their products. Theodore declined all of it. He went home to Massachusetts, to the apartment above the shoe factory where his parents still lived. His mother held him for a long time without speaking. His father shook his hand with the formal gravity of New England men and said that he was proud. Theodore took a job at the textile mill where his father had worked for 30 years. He married a local girl named Catherine in 1947, and they had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. He rose through the ranks at the mill, becoming a supervisor, then a manager, then eventually a partner in the company. He never grew any taller. People in Fall River knew who he was, knew what he had done, but they learned not to bring it up. Theodore did not like to talk about the war. He did not display his Medal of Honor or his other decorations. He did not attend veterans' reunions or give speeches at Memorial Day ceremonies. When his children asked about the war, which they did often when they were young, Theodore told them only that he had done what needed to be done, and that he had been lucky. They knew he was not telling them everything, but they also knew that some things were too heavy to put into words. It was not until 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, that Theodore finally told the full story. A historian from Boston University had been researching the Siegfried Line campaign and had come across Theodore's Medal of Honor citation. He tracked Theodore down, now an old man of 61, and asked if he would be willing to share his experiences for an oral history project. Theodore agreed reluctantly. Catherine, his wife, told him that it was time. Their grandchildren deserved to know. The interview lasted for 3 days. Theodore spoke slowly, haltingly at first, then with growing fluency as the memories surfaced from wherever he had buried them for 40 years. He told the historian about growing up small in Fall River, about his mother's stories and his father's quiet support, about the recruitment office and the doctor who had told him he was too weak to serve. He told him about training, about the contempt of his squadmates, about the drill sergeant who had told him that size did not matter. He told him about combat, about the advance toward Germany, about the men he had fought beside and the men he had killed. And he told him about the night of October 14, 1944. He told him about the fog and the attack and the machine gun that no one thought he could operate. He told him about the wounds and the grenades and the shovel. He told him about the moment when the last Germans fled and he stood alone on the ridge, waiting for an attack that never came. He told him that he had not felt brave, he had felt necessary. The historian asked Theodore how he had done it, how a man of his size with his injuries had managed to kill 89 enemy soldiers in a single night. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. Then he told the historian something that had stayed with him for 40 years, something he had never shared with anyone before. He said that when he climbed out of that foxhole and ran for the machine gun, he had not been thinking about winning. He had not been thinking about glory or medals or proving anything to anyone. He had been thinking about the 37 wounded Americans lying in the aid station behind the ridge. Men who could not move, could not fight, could not defend themselves. He had been thinking about what would happen to them if the Germans broke through. Theodore said that he had spent his entire life being told what he could not do. Too small to carry a rifle, too weak to be a soldier, too limited to make a difference. On that night, when it mattered most, he had discovered that none of those limitations were real. The only limit that mattered was the limit a person placed on their own courage. Theodore Walsh died in 2001, at the age of 77. His funeral was held in the same church where he had been baptized, and the pews were filled with family members, former co-workers, and veterans from across New England who had heard his story and wanted to pay their respects. Among the attendees was a man in his 80s, a German immigrant named Friedrich Brenner, who had traveled from his home in Wisconsin specifically for the service. Brenner had been one of the 8 soldiers in that final squad, one of the 3 who had fled when Theodore met them with the shovel. He had spent 56 years carrying the memory of that moment, the image of the small American soldier who had refused to fall. After the war, Brenner had emigrated to America, built a life, raised a family. He had never told anyone about what happened on that ridge near Stolberg. The shame of running, of being defeated by a single man, was too deep to share. But when he read Theodore's obituary in the newspaper, something compelled him to attend the funeral. He did not speak to the family. He did not identify himself. He simply sat in the back of the church and listened to the eulogy, and when it was over, he walked outside and stood in the parking lot for a long time, looking at nothing. One of Theodore's sons noticed the old man standing alone and approached him. He asked if he had known his father. Brenner was quiet for a moment. Then he told the son the truth. He told him that he had been one of the Germans on that ridge. He told him that he had seen Theodore Walsh fight with a fury that seemed impossible, that should have been impossible, that defied everything the German soldiers had been told about American weakness and softness. He told him that Theodore Walsh had taught him something that night, something that had stayed with him for more than half a century. He told him that courage is not the same as size, and that the smallest man he ever saw in combat was also the bravest. Theodore's son stood in silence, processing what he had just heard. Then he reached out and shook the old German's hand. He told Brenner that his father would have wanted him to know that there was no shame in surviving. He told him that his father had never hated the men he fought, only the war that had forced them all into that terrible night. He told him that his father would have been glad to know that one of those soldiers had found peace. Brenner nodded. There were tears in his eyes. He attended the graveside service, standing at the back of the crowd, and when it was over he placed a small stone on Theodore's grave in the Jewish tradition of remembrance, though neither man was Jewish. It was simply a gesture of respect, one soldier to another. Theodore's oldest son delivered the eulogy. He talked about his father's quiet strength, his refusal to accept limitations, his lifelong belief that what mattered was not the size of the body but the size of the heart inside it. He told the story of the ridge near Stolberg. But he also told another story, one that Theodore had shared with his family near the end of his life. Theodore had told them about the moment after the battle, when he stood in the clearing smoke with the shovel in his hands, surrounded by the evidence of what he had done. He had told them that in that moment he had not felt like a hero. He had felt like the same small boy who had grown up in the apartment above the shoe factory, the boy everyone had underestimated, the boy his mother had told stories about small men who did great things. He had told them that he understood, finally, what his mother had been trying to teach him all those years. That size is an accident of birth, but courage is a choice, that the world will always try to tell you what you cannot do, but the world does not get to decide, that somewhere inside every person, no matter how small or weak or limited they appear, there is a strength that can move mountains. You just have to find it. Today, in the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, there is a display dedicated to the soldiers who fought along the Siegfried Line. Among the photographs and documents and artifacts is a Medal of Honor citation that describes what happened on a foggy night in October 1944. The citation does not mention that Theodore Walsh weighed 127 pounds. It does not mention that he had failed his first physical examination. It does not mention that his squad mates had called him Mouse. It simply describes what he did. And anyone who reads it understands that courage has nothing to do with size. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share in the comments what moved you most, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. These stories remind us that the greatest strength often hides in the smallest packages, and that the limits we accept are often the only limits that truly bind us. Help us keep these memories alive by sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.